The Social Policy Initiative has found that 8% of households in South Africa have all 22 perceived necessities for a decent standard of living. The report titled Decent Standard of Living focused on how multiple non-income dimensions of poverty impacted people's lives in the country. Social Policy Initiative Executive Director Isobel Frye joins us for more. Isobel, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Now, walk us through how the increased possession of socially perceived necessities, SPNs, since 2015, has improved the well-being of households facing poverty and inequality.
Thanks for the invitation, Hugo, and hello to all your listeners and viewers. The study itself really sought to try and move the debate of poverty away from basically survivalism and to a level of decent living. And so what we did, instead of doing the scientific approach of saying how many calories are required for someone to survive, which is what the food poverty line in South Africa is based on, we asked ordinary people what did they think was necessary for a decent or a dignified life, and we quantified that up. So as you said, there has been a fall in the cost of the decent standard of living, which in a way might assume that more people are able to access what the 22 socially perceived necessities are. But in fact, Hugo, I mean, the point is that the cost associated with people who have access to all 22 of the socially perceived necessities is 6,034 Rand per person per month. And as you said at the beginning, only 8% of South Africans have access to those 22 socially perceived necessities. 92% of South Africans are completely outside of that bracket. So the conclusion of the report is that while there has been some churning and some change, in fact, it's a very negative report card for a country that's on its way to try and meet the National Development Plan by 2030.
Now, when we talk about social perceived necessities, what are the top 5 of these socially perceived necessities, the SPNs as you call them?
Yeah, it's not a very helpful term to use, socially perceived necessities. It doesn't trip off the tongue, but it really is the methodology which we've employed, which is one that we adapted from a global approach. So we were a bit stuck with the socially perceived necessities. So the top 5 of the 22, and just to explain that the 22 were a limited number of the total basket of socially perceived necessities identified by people. Those are the ones that 2/3 of all participants agreed on. So there's a strict internal limitation, so there are no outliers. The first one, and this is very pertinent given Eskom's current performance, is the mains electricity in the house. So people identify electricity as being really important to live a decent life. Number 2 follows is someone to look after you if you're very ill. So that's an important variation. It's not a state-provided aspect, but it's a social need. Number 3 is a strong house that sustains bad weather and also security. Number 4 is street lighting, and that's been quite a big jump from the first study in 2015, where only 55% of respondents said it was important, now 75%. So I think that indicates a greater sense of vulnerability. So that's number 4. And number 5 is a fridge. Again, control over your life. Are you able to buy food in advance, saving money and knowing how you're going to be budgeting? So they are not luxury items. I think that's the first take-home point. Secondly, they're very much about people taking control of their lives, the state and other actors being the enabler to enable people to do so. And again, the reflection of where the state has failed to be the enabler, leaving people more despondent, and also more vulnerable. The lack of street lighting, if you drive around Johannesburg on any given night, even where there is no load shedding, there's no street lighting, and this is not township areas or rural areas where people are a lot more vulnerable.
Isobel, we've just been talking about crime stats for the last quarter, and obviously horrific yet again. Security does not feature in the top 5. Does it feature anywhere in the top 10 or amongst any of the SPNs?
It doesn't feature in the top 10, but it does feature in the SPNs. Number 17 is a fence or a wall around your property. So that's something to could sort of keep you in and others out. And then number 19 is burglar bars in the house. So it's clear that in addition to things like rubbish removal and refuse and sanitation, water and a bath, there are concerns for people, but they're not things that leap immediately to mind when people are asked to describe a decent standard of living. I think they're more an assumption of what's required to protect you rather than to advance your needs.
So when we look at these SPNs, do they vary across social demographics, across provinces? Do the people in Cape Town feel any different about SPNs to the people in Gauteng or Limpopo, for instance?
The interesting thing about the survey is that we weighted it very carefully so that we would get representative samples. But just to show, because it's a fascinating insight into the inequalities, the initial study which was published in 2018, we did it because we wanted to know, given the inequalities in South Africa and our historic differences, is there an ability to say there is an agreement as to what constitutes decent standard of living? The findings are about 98% correlation, so yes, there was. But researchers in Cape Town said that one of the differences in the focus groups that they held then was that working class people said that they needed to have a sofa, and middle class people said no, that was a luxury, that wasn't a necessity. And it transpired that for the middle class people, to have guests to stay, they had a spare room, whereas for working class people who had limited number of bedrooms, guests stayed on the sofa in the living room. So those are the ways in which the differences in realities come through. But over and above, the 22 represent, as I said, 2/3 majority agreement. So they are broadly reflective of the principles and values that people seek to attain to live a dignified life.
Isobel, how can fostering social networks, such as having someone to look after you when you're ill, contribute to community resilience among the disadvantaged households?
Again, that's a really interesting one because we found in the study there are three main ways of acquiring the socially perceived necessities. The one is the private sector market, the second is the public sector, which is the state, and the third are the social networks that you refer to. Now, we found that for particularly poorer people who weren't linked into any sort of state program or the private sector, social networks are important. And yet we also found, so for instance, either a neighbor, but more particularly faith-based membership and affiliation. If you belong to a church and they have a visiting roster. But there again, poverty is really important, Hugo, because if you don't have collection money, you can't go to church. Or if you don't have sufficient clothing, that you don't feel shamed by being amongst your peers for that, you get cut off of that. So there is a certain threshold of destitution and deprivation which cuts across even what people from the outside would think were resilient community networks and safety nets. That the pride amongst people of not being shown to be wanting is incredibly strong. And it's actually quite tragic and heartbreaking when you realize that those are the people who are not touched by any state program. And that really is why the argument for universal rather than targeted is so crucial, and it makes sense when you look at these findings.
So you've come up with this remarkable report. What happens now? Are you speaking to government? Are you speaking to the authorities? Where are you feeding it into?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, there's no point. Well, we don't do research in order just to publish. Our byline is research to make social change. So we were very honored to have the Minister of Social Development at the launch yesterday, particularly as she was zooming in from Zimbabwe, where she was there for the elections. That was a real commitment. We also had one of the planning commissioners there who took it very seriously. She herself is involved in similar research and committed that the National Development Plan goal of a decent standard of living would refer back to this. I think, Hugo, for us, the warmest take-home was that the Minister said how important it has been for her department, who supported some of the costing behind the research, to have this standard so that when they go toe-to-toe with National Treasury and argue for greater social grants, given the levels of unemployment being the main source of income, they're able to refer to this external study and say, this is the standard we need to be moving our grants towards. The child support grant was only 8% of the decent standard of living. They can argue it's not just keeping it in terms of inflation, but progressive constitutional realization means people need to be moved towards a decent standard of living. So it already has very direct applications. Two of us from the research team are also members of the National Minimum Wage Commission, myself and Trenton Elsley. So we bring it into a national wage setting. It's incredibly useful, but we want next year to be able to go down into subgroup analysis with our research partners and say, what is the particular meaning for women, for children, for people in rural areas, and what can local government take home, for instance, street lighting. That's a low-hanging fruit to enable people to live a decent standard of living. And so we seek to disaggregate the various items of the 22 and send them back really to the people who can make it happen.
Isobel Frye, Social Policy Initiative Executive Director. It's been a pleasure speaking to you this afternoon, unpacking for us that report titled Decent Standard of Living, focused on how multiple non-income dimensions of poverty impacted people's lives in South Africa.